backstage at the Lyceum Theatre in quaint St. Mary Mead, a playwright's strangled body is found, a crimson curtain cord tight around his neck, just hours before his play's premiere. Was it the ambitious director, driven by a thirst for control? The fiery actress hiding a scandalous secret? The desperate producer drowning in debt? Or the envious rival consumed by stolen dreams? Join Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unravelling secrets, as she sifts through clues, a smudged whiskey glass, a cryptic note, a broken watch chain, to unmask a killer in a village where everyone plays a part, but only one wrote the deadly final act. Chapter 1. The Curtain Rises. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its tidy cottages and winding lanes, hummed with an unusual energy on the eve of the Lyceum Theatre's annual production. The old theatre, a relic of grander days with its faded velvet seats and creaking stage, was the heart of the village's cultural life. And this year's offering, The Crimson Veil, promised to be a triumph. Its author, Leonard Grayson, was a man of considerable talent and even greater ego, whose sharp wit and sharper tongue had made him as many enemies as admirers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her chintz-covered armchair by the window of her neat drawing-room, observed the village's bustle with her customary quiet amusement. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the chatter of her young neighbour, Lucy Brent, who had stopped by for tea. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's going to be simply splendid," Lucy exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I'm ushering at the premiere tomorrow, and everyone says The Crimson Veil will put St. Mary Mead on the map. Mr. Grayson's play is ever so thrilling, full of secrets and betrayals." Her enthusiasm was infectious, but Miss Marple's mild blue eyes held a flicker of caution. She had known Lucy since she was a child, and the girl's tendency to romanticize everything reminded her of a certain housemaid who'd once been convinced a travelling salesman was a prince in disguise. People, Miss Marple knew, were rarely what they seemed. "Leonard Grayson is a clever man, no doubt," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but precise. "But cleverness can stir up trouble, Lucy dear. I do hope all goes smoothly." She adjusted her shawl and glanced out the window, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green. The Lyceum's faded marquee was just visible, its letters proclaiming The Crimson Veil in bold, if slightly peeling paint. Lucy prattled on about the cast and crew. Roland Vance, the ambitious director with a flair for the dramatic. Clara Morton, the glamorous actress whose temper was as famous as her beauty. Edmund Holt, the producer with a gambler's charm. And Sylvia Trent, a rival playwright whose own work had been eclipsed by Grayson's rising star. Miss Marple listened, her mind cataloguing each name, each detail, like threads in one of her intricate knitting patterns. Human nature, she reflected, was much like knitting. A single dropped stitch could unravel everything. The next morning, as Miss Marple sipped her breakfast tea, the village's tranquillity shattered. Lucy burst through the gate, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. "Miss Marple, it's awful!" she gasped. "Mr. Grayson, he's dead, found backstage at the Lyceum, strangled with a curtain cord." Her voice trembled, and she clutched the edge of the garden table to steady herself. Miss Marple set down her teacup with care, her expression unchanged save for a slight tightening of her lips. "Strangled, you say?" she murmured. "How very dreadful." And before his premiere too. She paused, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Strangling, she knew, was a personal act requiring strength and resolve. The choice of a curtain cord suggested something theatrical, almost symbolic. "Tell me, Lucy," she said gently, "who was at the theatre last night?" Lucy, still shaken, recounted what she knew. The cast and crew had been rehearsing late, and Grayson had been in a foul mood, snapping at everyone. Roland Vance had stormed out after a row over script changes. Clara Morton had been heard shouting in her dressing room. Edmund Holt had been pacing the foyer, muttering about money, and Sylvia Trent had been seen slipping in through the stage door. "It's all such a muddle," Lucy said, twisting her hands. "The police are there now, and Inspector Craddock's coming from Scotland Yard." At the mention of Craddock, Miss Marple's eyes brightened. She had a fondness for the young inspector, who, despite his modern methods, valued her insight into the darker corners of human behaviour. By midday, Craddock arrived at her cottage, his face grim under his neatly brushed hat. "A nasty business, Miss Marple," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Grayson was found at 6 this morning by the stage manager. Strangled, no question about it, and the theatre's in chaos. I'd value your thoughts if you'd care to take a look." Miss Marple folded her knitting and rose, her frail figure belying the sharpness of her mind. "I'm no detective, Inspector," she said with a small smile, "but I'll come along. A village theatre is like a village itself, you know, full of secrets if one knows where to look." As they walked to the Lyceum, Miss Marple's eyes darted about, noting the villagers' hushed whispers and curious glances. The theatre loomed ahead, its doors flung open to reveal a flurry of police activity. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and grease paint. Craddock led her backstage, where the body had been found. Though Grayson's remains had been removed, Miss Marple could picture the scene. The playwright slumped among the ropes and pulleys, the crimson cord tight around his throat. She glanced at the stage, where the set, for the Crimson Veil, stood half-finished. A grand staircase, a velvet curtain, a world of illusion now tainted by reality. "Curious," she said softly, her eyes lingering on a toppled chair and a glint of glass in the shadows. "A playwright's life is all about creating drama, Inspector. But this is a drama someone else has written." Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The Lyceum Theatre, with its peeling gilt and sagging velvet curtains, stood as a monument to St. Mary Mead's modest aspirations. By midday, its backstage had transformed from a haven of theatrical magic into a grim tableau of police activity. Miss Jane Marple, her slight figure wrapped in a sensible tweed coat, stepped carefully over the threshold, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Inspector Craddock, ever courteous, held the heavy stage door for her, his expression a mix of professional focus and quiet deference. He knew better than to underestimate the elderly spinster whose knack for untangling human motives rivaled his own detective's methods. "Thank you, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear, like the chime of a distant bell. "It's a sad day for the Lyceum, and for poor Mr. Grayson." She paused, her gaze sweeping the cluttered backstage, where ropes dangled like vines and props lay scattered like relics of a forgotten ritual. The air carried the mingled scents of sawdust, grease paint, and something sharper. Fear, perhaps, or the lingering trace of death. Craddock nodded, his notebook already open. "We found Grayson here, "Just after 6 this morning," he said, gesturing to a corner near a rack of costumes where a chalk outline marked the spot. The stage manager, Mr. Dobbs, stumbled on him during his morning rounds. Strangled with a curtain cord. Velvet, crimson, part of the set for the Crimson Veil. Ironic, don't you think? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A gesture that might have been mistaken for disapproval, but was in truth the first stitch in her mental tapestry. Ironic, yes, she murmured, but also deliberate, I suspect. A cord from the play's own set. It's almost as if the killer wished to make a statement. She stepped closer to the chalk outline, her small gloved hands clasped before her. The floor was scuffed, littered with splinters and a faint dusting of sawdust. But her eyes caught something else. A toppled chair, its wooden legs splayed like a fallen soldier, and nearby a glint of glass half hidden beneath a coil of rope. She bent slightly, her movements precise despite her age, and pointed. "Inspector, have you examined that glass? It seems out of place among all this disarray." Craddock followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "Good catch, Miss Marple." He signalled to a constable, who retrieved the object, a heavy whisky tumbler, its surface smudged with fingerprints. "We'll have it tested," Craddock said, slipping it into an evidence bag. Grayson wasn't known for moderation, but this could belong to someone else. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already threading possibilities. A whisky glass, she thought, was a curious artifact in a murder scene. It suggested intimacy, a shared moment, or perhaps a deliberate distraction. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a glass of sherry had revealed more about a vicar's wife than the lady cared to admit. "And the cord?" she asked, turning her attention to a length of crimson velvet draped over a prop table, its twin to the murder weapon. Craddock led her to it, explaining that the cord had been cut from the main curtain rigging, a thick, ornamental piece used to frame the stage. "Not something you'd grab in a hurry," he said. "It's heavy, decorative, more for show than function." Whoever used it had to know where to find it and how to wield it. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying the cord's texture. "Indeed," she said softly, "it's not a practical choice, is it? A rope or belt would have been easier. This feels personal, theatrical, even." She glanced at the costume rack, where silks and satins hung in disarray, as if someone had rifled through them in haste. A single feather boa lay tangled on the floor, its pink plumes absurdly cheerful against the grim scene. She made a mental note of it, wondering if it belonged to Clara Morton, the tempestuous actress whose flair for drama extended beyond the stage. Craddock flipped through his notebook. "We've narrowed it down to 4 suspects, all backstage last night. Roland Vance, the director, sharp fellow, but Grayson was driving him mad with last-minute script changes. Clara Morton, the lead actress, had a public spat with Grayson over her role. Edmund Holt, the producer, he's in debt up to his ears, and Grayson's play was his lifeline. And Sylvia Trent, a rival playwright, bitter about Grayson stealing her thunder." Miss Marple listened, her expression serene but her mind alert. "A director, an actress, a producer, and a rival," she said, almost to herself, "each with a reason to resent poor Mr. Grayson. But resentment is one thing, Inspector. Murder requires something stronger. Hatred, fear, or perhaps desperation." She stepped carefully around a pile of discarded scripts, her eyes catching a crumpled program for the Crimson Veil, wedged beneath a prop sword. She bent to retrieve it, her fingers deft despite the chill in the air. The programme was elegantly printed, its cover adorned with a stylized veil in shades of red and gold. But inside, a handwritten note caught her attention. "You'll pay for stealing my work. S." The ink was fresh, the handwriting sharp and angular, as if written in anger. She handed it to Craddock, her expression unreadable. "This could be significant," she said, "or it could be a distraction." "In my experience, Inspector, people who leave notes are either very clever or very foolish." Craddock's eyes narrowed as he examined the note. "Sylvia Trent, perhaps?" That S could point to her. She's got motive. Grayson's success came at her expense. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "But a note like this is too convenient, don't you think? Almost as if someone wanted us to suspect Miss Trent." She glanced around the backstage, her gaze lingering on the shadows cast by the overhead lights. The Lyceum, she thought, was a place of illusion, where truth hid behind painted flats and false faces. She recalled a village girl, years ago, who'd left a letter to misdirect suspicion after stealing from her employer. The trick, Miss Marple knew, was to look beyond the obvious. As Craddock's team bustled about, dusting for prints and cataloguing evidence, Miss Marple took a moment to survey the broader scene. The backstage was a maze of narrow passages, with pulleys and counterweights overhead, their ropes swaying faintly in the draught. A ladder led to a catwalk above, where stage hands adjusted lights and scenery. She noted a faint scuff mark on the ladder's lowest rung, as if someone had climbed it in a hurry. "Inspector," she said, pointing, "might someone have been up there last night?" "Watching, perhaps, or hiding?" Craddock followed her gaze, his interest piqued. "Worth checking," he said, motioning to a constable to investigate. "If someone was up there, they'd have had a clear view of Grayson, and the chance to slip away unnoticed." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the suspects. Roland Vance, with his nervous cufflinks and obsession with control, might have seen Grayson's interference as a threat to his vision. Clara Morton, with her fiery temper and strong hands, could have acted in a moment of rage. Edmund Holt, desperate to save his finances, might have viewed Grayson's demands as the final straw. And Sylvia Trent, with her quiet bitterness, had the knowledge of stagecraft to choose a cord and tie a knot. Each, Miss Marple thought, was like a character in one of Grayson's plays, their motives woven into a complex plot. She stepped toward the stage, where the set for the Crimson Veil stood half-assembled. A grand staircase dominated the scene, its polished wood gleaming under the worklights. At its base, a velvet curtain hung in heavy folds, its crimson hue echoing the murder weapon. Miss Marple paused, her eyes tracing the curtain's hem where a small tear caught her attention. It was barely noticeable, but the threads were frayed, as if something or someone had snagged it. She made a mental note, recalling a similar tear in a village seamstress's apron, which had led to the discovery of a hidden theft. "Inspector," she said, turning to Craddock, "this curtain, might it be worth examining? If it's part of the same set as the cord, there could be traces of the killer's presence." Craddock nodded, his respect for her growing. "You've got a sharp eye, Miss Marple. I'll have the team take a closer look." He jotted a note, then glanced at his watch. "We're interviewing the suspects this afternoon at the vicarage. Would you care to sit in? Your perspective might be useful." Miss Marple smiled, a faint curve of her lips that held a world of understanding. "I'd be happy to, Inspector. People, you see, are much like plays. They reveal themselves in the quiet moments, when they think no one is watching." She adjusted her hat, a modest affair with a single feather, and followed Craddock out of the theatre, her mind already stitching together the fragments of the crime. As they walked back through St. Mary Mead, the village was abuzz with whispers. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, stood at her shop door, her apron dusted with flour as she recounted seeing Sylvia Trent near the theatre late the previous night, her coat stained with something dark. Mr. Dobbs, the postman, lingered by the green muttering about Edmund Holt's argument with a shadowy figure near the stage door, and young Lucy Brent, still shaken, hovered near Miss Marple's gate, her eyes wide with questions she dared not ask. Miss Marple took it all in, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. The Lyceum, she knew, was more than a theatre. It was a stage for human passions, where ambition, jealousy, and desperation played their parts. Leonard Grayson's death was no accident, but a carefully scripted act. The question was, who had written the final scene? As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple paused, her hand on the gate. "Inspector," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "do be careful with that glass. It may tell us more than the killer intended." She smiled, a glimmer of mischief in her eyes, and stepped inside, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of the Strangled Playwright. Chapter 3. The Director's Ambition. The vicarage at St. Mary Mead, with its ivy-clad walls and polished oak furniture, was an unlikely setting for a murder investigation. Yet it served admirably as a makeshift interview room. Its quiet dignity, presided over by the gentle Mrs. Brierly, the vicar's wife, lent an air of calm to the proceedings, though the tension among those gathered was palpable. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly, a picture of unobtrusive observation. Inspector Craddock, his notebook balanced on his knee, had arranged for the suspects to be questioned here, away from the Lyceum's chaotic atmosphere. The first to face scrutiny was Roland Vance, the director of the Crimson Veil, whose sharp features and restless energy seemed at odds with the vicarage's serenity. Vance entered with a flourish, his dark coat flapping like a stage curtain, his eyes darting about as if expecting an audience. He was a lean man in his late 30s, with a hawkish nose and a habit of adjusting his cufflinks. Silver, engraved with his initials, that Miss Marple noted with interest. She had seen such gestures before, in a St. Mary Mead grocer who'd fidgeted similarly when questioned about shortchanging customers. Small habits, she knew, often betrayed larger truths. "Mr. Vance," Craddock began, his tone brisk but polite, "you were backstage last night, correct? Can you tell us about your interactions with Leonard Grayson?" Vance leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate ease. "I was there, yes, until about 7. Rehearsals were a nightmare. Grayson kept rewriting the script, throwing everything off. We had words, I won't deny it. He was impossible, always meddling, undermining my direction." His voice carried a theatrical edge, as if he were delivering a monologue. "But I left him alive, Inspector. I had to meet the lighting crew in the auditorium." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild gaze resting on Vance. "And these words you had with Mr. Grayson," she said softly, "were they heated? I understand he could be difficult." Vance's eyes flicked to her, a flash of irritation crossing his face before he masked it with a smile. Heated? Perhaps. He wanted to cut Clara Morton's big scene, which was madness. She's the star. I told him he'd ruin the play, and he laughed in my face, said he'd do as he pleased. He twisted a cufflink, the silver glinting in the firelight. I stormed out, yes, but that's all. Directors don't strangle their playwrights, Miss Marple, no matter how maddening they are. She nodded, her expression serene, but her mind catalogued his words. Vance's ambition was evident. He saw the Crimson Veil as his chance to shine, perhaps to escape the provincial confines of St. Mary Mead for London's West End. Grayson's interference threatened that dream. She recalled a young organist in the village, driven to petty theft by his desperation for recognition. Ambition, she thought, could twist a man's soul as surely as a cord could twist a neck. Craddock pressed on. You say you left at 7. Can anyone confirm that? The lighting crew, Vance replied promptly. Tompkins and young Harris were with me, setting the spots. They'll tell you I was there until nearly 8 when I went home. His tone was confident, but Miss Marple noticed his fingers tighten on the cufflink, as if anchoring himself against doubt. Craddock jotted a note. We'll check with them. Did you see anyone else backstage before you left? Clara Morton, perhaps, or Edmund Holt? Sylvia Trent? Vance hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Clara was in her dressing room, I think. Heard her shouting earlier, something about her costume. Holt was lurking about, looking worried as usual. Money troubles, you know. And Sylvia... He paused, a faint smirk playing on his lips. She came in around 6:30, I'd say. Looked furious, clutching that scarf of hers like she meant to strangle. Someone with it, he caught himself, flushing slightly. Not literally, of course. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind weaving Vance's words into her growing tapestry. His mention of Sylvia Trent's scarf was intriguing, a detail offered too readily, perhaps to deflect suspicion. She remembered a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, who'd accused a rival of theft to cover her own misdeeds. Vance's ambition, she suspected, might extend to more than directing plays. As Craddock continued questioning Vance about the rehearsal schedule, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the vicarage window, where the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawn. The village was quiet now, but whispers of the murder had spread like wildfire. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, had mentioned seeing Vance leave the theatre in a huff, his coat flapping as he strode towards the green. Mr. Dobbs, the postman, had seen him later, arguing with someone near the pub, though he couldn't say who. These fragments, Miss Marple knew, were like the scattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, waiting to be fitted together. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. That'll be all for now, Mr. Vance. Don't leave Saint. Mary Mead without informing us. Vance rose, adjusting his coat with a flourish. I wouldn't dream of it, Inspector. The show must go on, you know, even without Grayson. He flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes and departed, leaving a faint scent of cologne in his wake. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers resting lightly on the skein of wool. A very confident man, Inspector, she said quietly. But confidence can be a mask, don't you think? Like the painted faces in Mr. Grayson's play. Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. You think he's hiding something? I think, she replied, her voice soft as a whisper, that Mr. Vance is a man who likes to control the stage. But when the script changes unexpectedly, even a director can lose his lines. She smiled faintly, her eyes bright with the quiet certainty of one who had seen many masks slip in St. Mary Mead. As Craddock prepared for the next interview, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Vance's cufflinks. Such a small detail, yet so revealing. She recalled a village schoolmaster who'd twisted his tie-pin when lying about a broken window. Vance's ambition, she suspected, was a thread that might lead to the heart of this mystery. If only she could find where it was knotted. Chapter 4. The Actress's Temper. The vicarage drawing-room, with its chintz curtains and faint scent of lavender polish, seemed an odd stage for the interrogation of Clara Morton, the leading lady of the Crimson Veil. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, unobtrusive rhythm, the room took on the air of a theatre itself, where truths and pretences played out under the watchful eyes of Inspector Craddock. Clara entered with the grace of a born performer, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her emerald dress clinging to her figure like a costume designed to command attention. But her eyes, dark and restless, betrayed a nervousness that no amount of stagecraft could conceal. "Miss Morton," Craddock began, his tone steady as he gestured to a chair opposite him. "Thank you for coming. We need to discuss your movements last night at the Lyceum, particularly your interactions with Leonard, Grace and Clara," sat, crossing her legs with a deliberate elegance, her hands folded in her lap. Her fingers, Miss Marple noted, were adorned with a single sapphire ring, but they trembled slightly, as if struggling to maintain their composure. "I was at the theatre, of course," Clara said, her voice clear but tinged with defiance. "Rehearsing until nearly 7, then in my dressing room. Leonard was, well, Leonard. Difficult, as always." She tossed her head, a gesture that might have been fetching on stage but seemed brittle here. Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "We've heard there was an argument between you and Grayson. Care to elaborate?" Clara's lips tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might refuse to answer. Then, with a sigh that was almost theatrical, she spoke. "He wanted to rewrite my role, cut my best scene, give it to that simpering understudy, Lily Bates. Said she had freshness. Freshness!" Her voice rose, a spark of her reputed temper flaring. "I told him he'd regret it, that I'd made his play what it was." We shouted, "Yes, but that's theatre. It wasn't murder." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild gaze resting on Clara's flushed face. She recalled a young woman in St. Mary Mead, a farmer's daughter with a fiery temper, who'd once thrown a teapot at her suitor in a fit of jealousy. Passion, Miss Marple knew, could burn bright, but often left ashes of regret. "Miss Morton," she said gently, her voice cutting through the tension like a soft breeze. "You were in your dressing room after this argument alone, I presume. Did anyone see you there?" Clara's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, a flicker of surprise crossing her features, as if she hadn't expected the elderly spinster to speak. "Alone, yes," she said, her tone cautious. "I needed to collect myself. I didn't see anyone, and no one saw me, as far as I know." Her fingers tightened on the sapphire ring, twisting it as if it were a talisman. Craddock jotted a note, his expression unreadable. "And what time did you leave the theatre?" 8, perhaps a bit later," Clara replied, her voice steadier now. "I went straight home. My landlady, Mrs. Gibbs, can confirm I was in by 9. She hesitated, then added, "I didn't kill him, Inspector." I'm an actress, not a monster." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm, but her mind was far from idle. Clara's alibi was thin, resting on the word of a landlady who might not note the precise hour. More intriguing was the fear in Clara's eyes, not the bold defiance of a guilty woman, but the anxious flicker of someone guarding a secret. Miss Marple thought of a saint, Mary Mead governess, who'd hidden an indiscretion behind a similar mask of bravado. "Miss Morton," she said, her tone as gentle as a lullaby, "you mentioned Mr. Grayson's threat to cut your role. Was there anything else he said or did that upset you?" Clara's composure faltered, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "He was cruel," she said at last, her voice low. "He mocked me, said I was past my prime. But that's all. I didn't touch him." Her eyes darted to the window, where the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the vicarage garden, as if seeking escape. Craddock pressed further, asking about Clara's interactions with the other suspects. "Did you see Roland Vance, Edmund Holt, or Sylvia Trent backstage?" Clara frowned, her fingers stilling on the ring. "Roland was arguing with Leonard earlier. Something about the script, as usual. I heard them from my dressing room. Edmund was there too, pacing like a caged animal. He's always worried about money, Sylvia. I saw her near the stage door, looking like she'd swallowed a lemon. She and Leonard never got on." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned Sylvia. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the crime scene. The whiskey glass, the crumpled programme, the torn curtain, all were threads in a tapestry that was slowly taking shape. Clara's temper, she suspected, was genuine, but her fear suggested something deeper, perhaps a personal grievance with Grayson that went beyond professional rivalry. She recalled the feather boa on the backstage floor, its pink plumes so like the flamboyant style Clara favoured. Had it been hers, dropped in a moment of haste or struggle? The interview drew to a close, and Craddock thanked Clara, his tone formal. "We may need to speak with you again, Miss Morton. Please remain in St. Mary Mead." Clara rose, her movements fluid despite the tension in her frame. "I've nowhere else to go," she said, a trace of bitterness in her voice. "The play's all I have now." She swept out, leaving a faint scent of jasmine perfume lingering in the air. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes thoughtful. "A passionate woman, Inspector," she said softly. "Passion can lead to rash acts, but it can also be a mask for something else. Fear, perhaps, or shame." She paused, her gaze drifting to the fire, where flames danced over the logs. "I wonder what Miss Morton is so afraid of revealing." Craddock nodded, his respect for her insight evident. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, her voice as delicate as lace, "that Miss Morton is playing a role even now. But whether it's the role of a murderer or a victim, I cannot yet say." She smiled faintly, her mind already turning to the next suspect, her needles ready to weave another thread into the mystery of Leonard Grayson's death. Chapter 5. The Producer's Debts. The vicarage drawing room, bathed in the soft glow of a late September afternoon, maintained its air of quiet respectability as Inspector Craddock prepared to question Edmund Holt, the producer of The Crimson Veil. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed corner, her knitting a gentle counterpoint to the room's tension, observed the proceedings with her usual unobtrusive keenness. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the polished floor. But the warmth did little to ease the chill of suspicion that hung over the investigation. Holt's arrival was announced by Mrs. Brierly, who ushered him in with a nervous smile, before retreating to the kitchen. Edmund Holt was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with a ruddy complexion and a jovial manner that seemed strained under the weight of recent events. His suit, though well cut, was slightly rumpled, and his tie was loosened, as if he tugged at it in a moment of distress. Miss Marple noted the absence of a pocket watch, a detail that piqued her interest given the broken watch chain found near Grayson's body. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Butcher, perpetually in debt, whose cheerful demeanour had masked a life of quiet desperation. Holt, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth. "Mr. Holt," Craddock began, his voice steady as he opened his notebook, "you were at the Lyceum last night, correct? Can you walk us through your movements?" Holt sank into the chair opposite, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, despite the coolness of the room. "I was there, Inspector, yes," he said, his voice hearty but tinged with unease. "Running about like a headless chicken, trying to keep the production on track. Grayson was bleeding me dry with his demands. New costumes, extra rehearsals, all of it costing a fortune. I was backstage until about 7:30. Then I popped over to the Red Lion for a pint. Needed to clear my head." Craddock's pen paused. "The Red Lion? Can anyone confirm you were there?" "Oh, aye," Holt said, nodding vigorously. "Old man Carter, the barkeep, saw me." "So did half the village, I reckon. I was back home by 9, as my wife will tell you." He flashed a grin, but his eyes darted to Miss Marple, as if seeking her approval. She met his gaze with a serene smile, her needles clicking steadily. But her mind was alert to the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Mr. Holt?" Miss Marple said gently, her voice like a soft thread weaving through the conversation. "I understand the Crimson Veil was quite an investment for you. Mr. Grayson's demands must have been a great burden, especially if funds were." Tightholt's grin faltered, and he shifted in his seat. "Tight? Well, producing's a gamble, isn't it? Always a risk, but Grayson's play was a sure thing. If it succeeded, I'd be back in the black. If it failed—" He trailed off, his hand straying to his pocket, where a watch might once have rested. "But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. I needed him alive. His play was my lifeline." Craddock leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We found a broken watch chain near Grayson's body. Yours, perhaps." Holt's ruddy face paled slightly, and he tugged at his collar. "My watch? Lost it weeks ago, I did. Must have come loose during rehearsals. I'm always rushing about backstage. Things fall off." His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers clenched the handkerchief, as if anchoring himself against a rising tide of panic. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead shopkeeper, who'd lost a button in a scuffle, claiming it was an accident when it was anything but. "Lost it weeks ago," Craddock repeated, his tone sceptical. "Yet it was found near the body. Can you explain that?" Holt spread his hands, his smile returning, but less convincing. "Coincidence, Inspector." Backstage is a jumble. Ropes, props, costumes everywhere. That chain could have been there for days. I wasn't near Grayson when it happened." His voice wavered, and he glanced at Miss Marple again, as if hoping her kindly demeanour might soften the interrogation. Miss Marple tilted her head. her expression one of mild curiosity. "Mr. Holt, you mentioned Mr. Grayson's demands. Did you argue with him last night? I understand he could be quite insistent." "Argue?" Holt chuckled, though it sounded hollow. "We had a few words, sure." He wanted more funds for some fancy set piece, and I told him we were stretched thin. He got shirty, called me a penny pincher, but that's just how he was. I left him to it and went to the pub. His eyes flicked to the window, where the vicarage garden lay in quiet order, a stark contrast to the chaos of his words. Craddock pressed further, asking about Holt's interactions with the other suspects. "Did you see Roland Vance, Clara Morton, or Sylvia Trent backstage?" Holt rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing. "Vance was there, snapping at everyone." He and Grayson were at it over the script, again. Clara was in her dressing room, I think, heard her shouting earlier. Sylvia came in late, looking like she'd bitten into something sour. Didn't stay long, just hovered near the stage door. His tone was casual, but Miss Marple caught a slight hesitation when he mentioned Sylvia, as if weighing his words. Her needles paused, her mind threading together the fragments of the case. The broken watch chain was troubling, suggesting a struggle or a deliberate plant. Holt's financial straits gave him a motive. Grayson's extravagance could have pushed him to the brink, but his alibi, if verified, placed him at the Red Lion during the critical hour. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead farmer, deep in debt, who'd sworn he was at a market when his barn was set alight. Alibis, she knew, could be as fragile as spun sugar. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the vicarage's rosewood table, where a small vase of late roses stood. Their petals, beginning to droop, reminded her of the wilting hopes of those tied to the crimson veil. Holt's joviality, she suspected, was a facade, much like the painted flats of the Lyceum stage. His missing watch, the broken chain, the nervous sweat, all were threads in a pattern she was beginning to discern. Craddock closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "That's all for now, Mr. Holt. We'll verify your alibi with the Red Lion. Don't leave the village, Holt rose, mopping his brow again. Wouldn't dream of it, Inspector. Got to keep the show afloat, you know." His grin was strained, and he hurried out, leaving a sense of unease in his wake. Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap, her eyes thoughtful. "A man under pressure, Inspector," she said softly. "Debt can make people do desperate things, but it can also make them careless. That watch chain. It's a curious detail, don't you think?" Craddock nodded, his expression grim. If it's his, it puts him at the scene. But if he's telling the truth about losing it weeks ago, someone else might have placed it there. "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "In sync. Mary Mead, I once knew a man who lost a cufflink in a scuffle. He swore never happened. The truth, Inspector, often lies in what's missing as much as what's found." She smiled faintly, her mind already turning to the next thread in the tapestry of Leonard Grayson's murder. Chapter 6. The Rival's Envy. The vicarage drawing-room, with its soft light filtering through lace curtains, retained its air of quiet propriety, as Inspector Craddock prepared to interview Sylvia Trent, the final suspect in the murder of Leonard Grayson. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with their steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of gentleness and acuity. The fire in the grate had dwindled to a soft glow, casting faint shadows that danced across the room like hesitant players on a stage. Mrs. Brierly, ever the gracious hostess, brought in a fresh pot of tea before withdrawing, her footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. Sylvia Trent entered with a measured step, her appearance a stark contrast to the flamboyance of Clara Morton or the restless energy of Roland Vance. She was a woman in her early 40s, with a sharp, angular face and dark hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her grey dress was austere, almost severe, but around her neck she wore a silk scarf, its deep indigo hue a single note of colour. Miss Marple noted the way Sylvia's fingers toyed with the scarf's edge, a nervous habit that reminded her of a saint. Mary Mead's schoolteacher who'd clutched a handkerchief when questioned about a missing library book. Small gestures, she knew, often spoke louder than words. "Miss Trent," Craddock began, his voice calm but authoritative as he gestured to a chair. "You were at the Lyceum last night, I understand. Can you tell us about your visit and your relationship with Leonard Grayson?" Sylvia sat, her posture rigid, her hands resting lightly on the scarf as if it were a shield. "I was there briefly," she said, her voice low and precise, with a hint of bitterness that sharpened its edges. "I went to speak with Leonard about professional matters. We had a history, you see. His play, The Crimson Veil, was chosen over mine for the Lyceum season. I wanted to know why her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes, dark and intense, fixed on a point beyond Craddock, as if seeing something only she could discern. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild gaze resting on Sylvia's face. "A professional disappointment must be very trying, Miss Trent," she said gently, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "I understand, Mr. Grayson's success came at a cost to your own work. That would weigh heavily on anyone." Sylvia's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, a flash of surprise crossing her features before she masked it with a tight smile. "It was more than a disappointment," she said, her voice sharpening. "Leonard stole my ideas." "My play, Moonlit Shadows, had similar themes, a betrayal, a hidden truth, a dramatic reveal. He read my script last year, when we were both vying for the Lyceum slot. Then his play appears, suspiciously similar, and mine's rejected. He laughed when I confronted him, said I was imagining things." Her fingers tightened on the scarf, twisting it until the fabric strained. Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "So you went to the Lyceum to confront him? What time was this, and what happened?" Sylvia hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Around 6:30, I think. I found him backstage, near the costume rack. He was in one of his moods, arrogant, dismissive. I told him I knew what he'd done, that he'd pay for it one way or another. He mocked me, said I'd never match his talent. I left soon after, before 7. He was alive when I walked away." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands, as if the memory still stung. Craddock's pen scratched across the page. "And where did you go after leaving the theatre?" "Home," Sylvia said quickly. "I live alone, so there's no one to confirm it, but I was in by 7:30. I didn't go back to the Lyceum." She lifted her chin, a gesture of defiance, but her eyes held a flicker of unease that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet curiosity. "Miss Trent, you mentioned Mr. Grayson's mockery. It must have been terribly provoking. And that scarf of yours, it's lovely, but I couldn't help noticing how you hold it. Almost as if it's a comfort in difficult moments, Sylvia's fingers froze on the scarf, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's just a habit," she said, her tone clipped. "I've always fidgeted with it when I'm nervous." Nothing more. But the way she smoothed the fabric, as if to erase her own gesture, told Miss Marple otherwise. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who twisted a lace handkerchief when hiding her son's misdeeds. Nervous habits, she knew, often betrayed a deeper truth. Craddock pressed on, his voice firm. "We found a note in a program near Grayson's body. It read, 'You'll pay for stealing my work.'" "S. Your initial, Miss Trent. Care to explain?" Sylvia's face paled, and for a moment she seemed to shrink into her chair. "I didn't write it," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I told Leonard he'd pay, yes, but not in a note. Someone's trying to make it look like I did it." Her eyes darted to Craddock, then to Miss Marple, as if seeking an ally. "I despise Leonard. I won't deny it. But I didn't kill him." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind weaving Sylvia's words into the growing pattern of the case. The note was a troubling detail, too convenient, as she'd thought at the crime scene. Its angular handwriting didn't match Sylvia's precise, controlled demeanour, suggesting either a forgery or a calculated attempt to frame her. The scarf, too, was significant. Sylvia's familiarity with stagecraft. She'd once worked as a stagehand at the Lyceum, a fact Miss Marple had gleaned from village gossip, made her adept with ropes and knots, perhaps even a velvet curtain cord. But the fear in her eyes suggested she was as much a victim of circumstance as Grayson had been. Craddock asked about Sylvia's interactions with the other suspects. "Did you see Roland Vance, Clara Morton, or Edmund Holt backstage?" Sylvia nodded, her composure returning. "Roland was there, arguing with Leonard about the script. I heard Clara's voice from her dressing room. She sounded furious. Something about her role. Edmund was pacing near the stage door, muttering to himself. I didn't stay long enough to talk to any of them." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple noted the careful way she chose her words, as if measuring their weight. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the crime scene. The whiskey glass with its smudged fingerprints, the torn curtain, the feather boa tangled on the floor. Sylvia's scarf, she mused, was not unlike the curtain cord in its texture, a detail that might mean nothing or everything. She recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress who'd used a ribbon to strangle a rival's reputation, if not her person. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could drive people to desperate acts, but so could the fear of being exposed. The interview concluded, and Craddock closed his notebook. "Thank you, Miss Trent. We'll need to speak with you again. Please don't leave, Saint." Mary Mead. Sylvia rose, her movements stiff, her scarf clutched tightly in one hand. "I've no reason to run," she said, her voice low. "I've already lost everything that mattered." She left the room, her footsteps echoing in the quiet vicarage, leaving behind a sense of unresolved tension. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes thoughtful. "A woman consumed by envy, Inspector," she said softly, "but also one who fears something more than suspicion. That note, it's too neat, don't you think? Like a prop left on stage to point the audience in the wrong direction." Craddock nodded, his brow furrowed. "You think someone's framing her?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, her voice as delicate as the lace she knitted, "that Miss Trent is part of a larger play, one where the killer has written a clever script, But every script has a flaw, Inspector, if one knows where to look." She smiled faintly, her mind already tracing the threads that would lead to the truth behind Leonard Grayson's murder. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting St. Mary Mead in a gentle twilight, as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to her cottage from the vicarage. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke, and the village was settling into its evening quiet. Yet, beneath the calm, a current of unease rippled through the lanes, fueled by the shocking murder of Leonard Grayson. Miss Marple, her steps measured but purposeful, carried her knitting bag over one arm, her mind as active as ever, sifting through the threads of gossip that wove the village together like one of her intricate lace patterns. She paused at the garden gate of her cottage, where the last roses clung stubbornly to their stems, and glanced across the green. The lights of the Red Lion glowed warmly, and the faint hum of voices suggested the villagers were gathering to share their theories about the Lyceum's tragedy. Miss Marple knew that gossip, like a poorly knitted stitch, could be misleading, but it often held a kernel of truth. She had learned much from the chatter of St. Mary Mead over the years. A wayward glance, a whispered rumour, a fleeting detail could unravel even the most carefully spun deception. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple set the kettle to boil and settled into her armchair by the window. Her knitting resumed as she reflected on the day's interviews. Roland Vance's ambition, Clara Morton's temper, Edmund Holt's debts, and Sylvia Trent's envy each formed a distinct thread in the tapestry of the case. But it was the village's whispers that might tie them together. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, scandal years ago, when a grocer's wife had uncovered a theft by listening to the idle talk at the post office. The truth, Miss Marple knew, often hid in plain sight, waiting for a keen ear to catch it. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, her round face flushed with excitement and a basket of scones in hand. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, bustling in without waiting for an invitation. "I had to come by. The whole village is talking about poor Mr. Grayson. I thought you'd want to hear what's being said." She set the basket on the table and perched on the edge of a chair, her eyes bright with the thrill of news. Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea with her usual grace. "You're very kind, Mrs. Price. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of interesting things. Do tell me." Her tone was gentle, encouraging, like a shepherd guiding a flock. She knew Mrs. Price's penchant for gossip was matched only by her sharp memory for detail. Mrs. Price leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the walls might eavesdrop. "Well, I was at the shop last night, closing up, and I saw that Sylvia Trent walking past the Lyceum. Must have been near 8. She had a dark stain on her coat, mud maybe, or something else. Looked ever so upset, she did, clutching that scarf of hers like it was her lifeline." She paused, her eyes wide. "And then there's Mr. Holt. My Tom saw him arguing with someone near the stage door earlier, around 6 before he went to the Red Lion. Couldn't see who, mind, but it was heated." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene, but her mind alert. The stain on Sylvia's coat was a new detail, suggestive of a struggle, or perhaps a hasty departure from the crime scene. Holt's argument, too, was intriguing. Could it have been with Grayson, or another player in this drama? "Very interesting, Mrs. Price," she said, offering a scone. "And what about Miss Morton? Or Mr. Vance? Has anyone mentioned them?" Mrs. Price took a scorn, her enthusiasm undimmed. "Oh, Clara Morton's been the talk of the tea shop. Young Lucy Brent, she's ushering at the Lyceum, you know, said she heard Clara crying in her dressing room last night, muttering about ruining everything." "Sounded heartbroken," Lucy said, not angry. As for Mr. Vance, Mr. Dobbs, the postman, saw him storm out of the theatre around 7, looking like thunder. Said he was muttering about Grayson ruining his big chance. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving these fragments into the growing pattern. Lucy's account of Clara's tears suggested a personal wound, perhaps tied to her fear during the interview. Vance's anger, meanwhile, reinforced his ambition as a motive, but his alibi with the lighting crew needed verification. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead housemaid who'd cried over a broken vase, only to reveal later it was a gift from a forbidden suitor. Tears, like stains, could tell a story if one knew how to read them. The door opened again, and Lucy Brent herself appeared, her young face pale but eager. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to barge in," she said, twisting her hands, "but I heard you were helping Inspector Craddock, and I thought you should know something." She glanced at Mrs. Price, hesitating, but Miss Marple's encouraging nod prompted her to continue. "It's about Miss Morton. Last night when I was tidying the foyer, I heard her in her dressing room crying like her heart was breaking. She kept saying, 'He'll ruin everything, he'll tell them all.' I didn't think much of it then, but now—" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp as ever. "Thank you, Lucy dear. That's very helpful. Did you hear anything else, perhaps about Mr. Holt or Miss Trent?" Lucy shook her head, her curls bouncing. "Not much, but I saw Mr. Holt near the stage door, looking worried, and Miss Trent was there too, slipping out just after 7. She didn't see me, but she looked frightened, I think." Lucy's voice faltered, and she added, "It's all so dreadful, Miss Marple." Who could do such a thing? Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch as comforting as her words. "People do terrible things when they're desperate, Lucy. But we'll find the truth. Don't you worry." She offered Lucy a scone, her mind already turning over the new information. Sylvia's frightened expression, Clara's cryptic words, Holt's argument, all were pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. As Mrs. Price and Lucy chatted, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the crime scene, the whiskey glass, the crumpled programme with its accusing note, the torn curtain. The village whispers added colour to these details, painting a picture of a night fraught with tension. Sylvia's stained coat and frightened demeanour suggested she'd been near something, or someone, significant. Clara's tears hinted at a secret Grayson might have threatened to expose. Holt's argument, if with Grayson, could point to a financial motive, but the broken watch chain complicated his story. Mrs. Price rose to leave, promising to keep her ears open for more gossip. Lucy followed, her youthful energy tempered by the weight of the day. Miss Marple saw them out, then returned to her armchair. Her knitting resumed as she gazed out at the darkening village. The Lyceum, she thought, was a stage for more than plays. It was a crucible where human passions burned bright. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, who'd been caught stealing after a neighbour noticed dirt on his boots. Small details, like stains or tears, could unravel even the cleverest deception. As the kettle whistled softly, Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, her mind stitching together the village's whispers with the evidence at hand. The truth, she murmured to herself, is like a play's final act. It's there, waiting in the wings if one knows where to look. With a faint smile, she picked up her needles, ready to weave the next thread in the mystery of the Strangled Playwright. Chapter 8. The Programme's Secret. The morning after the interviews at the vicarage, Miss Jane Marple rose early, her mind as crisp as the autumn air that drifted through St. Mary Mead. The village was still cloaked in a soft mist, the rooftops barely visible as she made her way to the Lyceum Theatre, where Inspector Craddock had agreed to let her revisit the crime scene. Her sensible shoes tapped lightly on the cobblestones, and her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a familiar companion in her quiet pursuit of truth. The murder of Leonard Grayson had cast a shadow over the village, but Miss Marple knew that shadows often hid the clearest clues if one had the patience to look. The Lyceum's heavy doors creaked as she entered, the air inside cool and heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. Craddock was already there, his figure silhouetted against the stage lights, directing a constable to photograph a section of the backstage area. He turned at her approach, his face lighting with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple, you're up early. I thought you might want to see the scene again before we clear it. Anything particular on your mind?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her expression remained serene. "Just a few loose threads, Inspector," she said softly. "Sometimes revisiting a place helps one see what was missed in the heat of the moment." She stepped carefully into the backstage maze, her gaze sweeping over the ropes, pulleys, and scattered props. The chalk outline of Grayson's body was still visible, a stark reminder of the violence that had unfolded here. But her attention was drawn to the crumpled program she had noticed before, now bagged as evidence, but lying on a prop table for inspection. "May I see that program again, Inspector?" she asked, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. Craddock handed it to her, and she examined it through the plastic, her fingers tracing the edges of the elegant booklet. The cover, adorned with a stylized crimson veil, was unremarkable, but inside, the handwritten note, "You'll pay for stealing my work, Estes," stood out like a false note in a familiar tune. The ink was dark, the handwriting sharp and angular, but something about it struck her as staged, almost too deliberate. She recalled a St. Mary Mead letter, penned by a jealous suitor to frame a rival, its tone too perfect to be genuine. "This note," she said, handing it back to Craddock, "is very curious, don't you think? It points so directly at Miss Trent, yet it feels contrived, as if someone wanted us to look at her and nowhere else." Her eyes scanned the backstage, landing on the whiskey glass, now bagged and labelled, its smudged fingerprints a silent witness to the night's events. "And the glass! Have your men found anything from it?" Craddock nodded, flipping open his notebook. "Preliminary results show fingerprints, but they're smudged. Not clear enough for a definitive match yet. Could be Grayson's, could be someone else's. We're running further tests, but it's slow work." He gestured to the costume rack, where the crimson curtain cord, twin to the murder weapon, still hung. "We've also checked the cord. Nothing but Grayson's DNA so far, though we're looking for trace evidence." The tear in the curtain you pointed out is being analysed too." Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind weaving these details into her mental tapestry. The smudged fingerprints suggested haste or deliberation, someone wiping the glass perhaps, but not thoroughly enough. The note, with its accusing S, was a bolder stroke, a theatrical flourish meant to mislead. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead seamstress who'd left a forged receipt to deflect suspicion from her theft. "The killer," she murmured, almost to herself, "is playing a part, Inspector." But every actor leaves a trace, even if it's just a shadow. She stepped towards the stage, where the set for the Crimson Veil stood in its half-finished glory. The grand staircase gleamed under the worklights, its polished wood a silent witness to the drama. The velvet curtain, with its small tear, hung heavily at the side, its crimson folds echoing the murder weapon. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing, as she noticed a faint thread caught in the tear. A silky strand, indigo in hue, not unlike Sylvia Trent's scarf. She pointed it out to Craddock, her voice soft but precise. "This thread, Inspector." "It's not from the curtain itself, is it?" "Perhaps it's worth comparing to Miss Trent's scarf." Craddock's eyebrows rose, and he signalled a constable to collect the thread. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple." If it matches, it could place Sylvia at the scene, though she admitted being there, so it might not prove much. "True," Miss Marple said, her smile faint but knowing. "But it's the small things, Inspector, that tell the story. A thread, a smudge, a word out of place, they're like stitches in a pattern." She turned back to the programme, her mind lingering on the note. Its handwriting, she suspected, was a clue in itself, but whether it was Sylvia's or a clever imitation she couldn't yet say. She recalled a village boy who'd forged a note to skip school, only to be caught by the slant of his letters. Details, she knew, were the key to unravelling deception. As Craddock's team continued their work, Miss Marple wandered to the edge of the stage, her gaze drifting to the auditorium, where empty seats stretched into the shadows. The Lyceum, she thought, was a place of illusion, where truth was masked by grease paint and spotlights. The note, the glass, the thread, all were props in a larger drama, one the killer had scripted with. You care? But every script had a flaw, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. She turned to Craddock, her expression thoughtful. "Inspector, have you spoken to the stage manager, Mr.?" Dobbs again. He found the body, but he might have seen something earlier. Someone lingering, perhaps, or something out of place. Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "Good idea." Dobbs mentioned seeing Holt near the stage door, but he was vague about the time. "I'll press him for details. Anything else you'd suggest?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained gentle. "Just keep an eye on the small things, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, I once solved a mystery because of a misplaced hairpin. The truth is often in what's overlooked." She adjusted her shawl, her mind already turning to the village whispers she'd heard from Mrs. Price and Lucy Brent. Sylvia's stained coat, Clara's tears, Holt's argument. Each was a thread, and the programme's note was a knot that might tie them together, or unravel them entirely. As she left the Lyceum, the mist had lifted, and St. Mary Mead sparkled in the morning light. Miss Marple walked slowly, her knitting bag a comforting weight at her side. The programme's secret, she knew, was more than a note. It was a clue to the killer's intent, a deliberate misdirection in a play where every act was calculated. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Vicar, who'd hidden a theft behind a sermon, only to be betrayed by a single word. With a faint smile, she stepped into her cottage, ready to weave the next thread in the mystery of the Strangled Playwright. Chapter 9. The Actress's Confession. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's quaint cottages and lending a deceptive calm to the air. Inside Miss Jane Marple's cottage, the atmosphere was far from serene as she prepared to meet Clara Morton once more. Inspector Craddock had agreed to a private conversation, sensing that the actress's guarded demeanour during her interview at the vicarage concealed more than she had revealed. Miss Marple, her knitting neatly folded in her lap, sat by the window, her mild eyes alert as she awaited Clara's arrival. The ticking of the mantel clock was the only sound, a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Clara entered with less of her usual theatrical flair, her emerald dress replaced by a simpler grey frock, though her auburn hair still gleamed with careful arrangement. Her hands, bare of the sapphire ring Miss Marple had noted before, clasped a small handbag tightly, as if it were an anchor. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and hesitant, "Inspector Craddock said you wanted to speak with me. I don't know what more I can say." Her eyes, shadowed with fatigue, darted to the window, avoiding Miss Marple's gentle gaze. Miss Marple rose, offering a chair with a gesture as warm as the tea she poured. "Please, sit, my dear," she said, her tone soothing, like a grandmother calming a fretful child. "I only wish to understand a little better. You see, in St. Mary Mead, I've learned that people sometimes hold back, not out of guilt, but out of fear. And I think you're afraid of something, aren't you?" Clara sank into the chair, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her secret had grown too heavy. For a moment, she was silent, her fingers twisting the strap of her handbag. Then, with a shuddering breath, she spoke. "You're right, Miss Marple. I am afraid, not of being accused, but of what Leonard knew." Her voice broke and tears welled in her eyes, smudging the careful makeup that had masked her distress. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression one of quiet compassion. "What did Mr. Grayson know, Miss Morton? Something personal, perhaps? Something he threatened to reveal?" She recalled a saint, Mary Mead governess who'd wept over a secret love, her tears betraying more than her words ever could. Clara's distress, she sensed, was rooted in something deeper than a professional spat. Clara's hands trembled, and she pressed them to her face, as if to hide from the truth. "It was an affair," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Leonard and we were involved months ago when rehearsals began. I thought it was love, but he used me. When I tried to end it, he threatened to tell everyone, to ruin my reputation. He said he'd tell the cast, the papers, even my family back in London. I couldn't bear it." Her tears fell freely now, and she fumbled in her handbag for a handkerchief, her movements jerky and desperate. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting untouched as she listened. "And last night, during your argument, did he repeat this threat?" she asked gently, her voice a soft thread weaving through Clara's confession. "Yes," Clara said, her voice breaking. "He was in a foul mood, rewriting my scenes, mocking me. I confronted him backstage, near the costume rack, and he laughed. Said if I didn't play my part his way, he'd make sure everyone knew about us. I was so angry, so humiliated. I told him I hated him, that he'd regret it, but I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, I swear." Her eyes, wide and pleading, met Miss Marple's, searching for belief. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind was as sharp as the needles in her lap. Clara's confession explained her fear. The tears Lucy Brent had overheard, the cryptic words about ruining everything. It was a motive, certainly. Grayson's threat to expose her could have driven her to desperation. But the raw emotion in her voice rang true. Miss Marple thought of a saint. Mary Mead seamstress who'd hidden a scandal, her fear palpable, but her hands clean of worse crimes. "I believe you, my dear," she said softly, "but you must tell Inspector Craddock everything. The truth, even when it's painful, is the only way to clear your name." Clara shook her head, her tears falling onto the handkerchief. "I can't," she whispered. "If it gets out, I'll be ruined. My career, my family, they'll never look at me the same way." She clutched the handkerchief, her knuckles white, and Miss Marple noted the strength in those hands, capable, perhaps, of pulling a cord tight, but trembling now with shame rather than guilt. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, her movements deliberate. "Miss Morton, keeping secrets can be more dangerous than revealing them. If you were backstage, did you see anyone else? Mr. Vance, perhaps, or Mr. Holt, Miss Trent?" She kept her tone gentle, but her eyes were keen, watching for any flicker of recognition. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "I saw Sylvia Trent near the stage door, just before I left." She looked strange, almost frightened. "And Mr. Holt was there earlier, arguing with someone. I couldn't see who, but it was loud. Roland Vance was storming about, shouting at the crew. It was chaos, Miss Marple. I just wanted to get away." Her voice faltered, and she dabbed at her eyes, her composure fraying like a worn costume. Miss Marple's mind wove these details into her tapestry. Clara's account aligned with the village whispers, Sylvia's frightened demeanour, Holt's argument, Vance's anger. The affair added a new thread, one that made Clara a target of Grayson's cruelty, but not necessarily his killer. The smudged whiskey glass, the note in the programme, the indigo thread in the curtain, all pointed to a carefully staged scene, and Clara's tears suggested she was a player, not the playwright. As Clara rose to leave, her face pale but resolute, Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. "Tell the inspector, my dear," she said. "He's a kind man, and he'll understand. Secrets have a way of coming out, and it's better they come from you." Clara nodded, her eyes still wet, and slipped out into the fading light, her steps heavy with the burden of her confession. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking as she reflected. Clara's secret was a piece of the puzzle, but it was the killer's script that intrigued her most. The notes accusing S, the smudged glass, the staged evidence, all suggested a mind that thrived on misdirection. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Vicar's wife, who'd hidden a theft behind a tearful confession, only to be undone by a single overlooked detail. "The truth," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "is like a curtain waiting to be drawn back. And I think we're close to the final act." Chapter 10. The Watch Chain Clue. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor as she prepared her morning tea. The village of St. Mary Mead was stirring. its usual calm disrupted by the ongoing investigation into Leonard Grayson's murder. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, had spent the previous evening mulling over Clara Morton's tearful confession. The village whispers and the tangible clues from the Lyceum's backstage. Each was a thread in the intricate tapestry she was weaving, but the broken watch chain found near Grayson's body tugged at her thoughts like a loose stitch. She knew, from years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead, that such small details often held the key to unravelling a mystery. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly at 10, his face etched with the weariness of a man grappling with a complex case. He carried a small evidence bag, which he placed on Miss Marple's rosewood table with a careful hand. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm despite his fatigue. "We've had a development. The watch chain we found near Grayson's body. It's definitely Holt's. And we've recovered his pocket watch too, tucked in a prop box backstage. Thought you'd want to see it before we send it for further analysis." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her mild eyes bright with interest as she examined the evidence through the plastic. The watch chain, silver and finely wrought, was snapped at one end, as if torn in a struggle. The pocket watch itself was an old-fashioned piece, its face slightly scratched, its hands frozen at 10 minutes to 7. "Curious," she murmured, her fingers hovering over the bag. "Mr. Holt claimed he lost this weeks ago, yet here it is, so close to the crime scene. And the time? 10 minutes to 7. That's significant, don't you think, Inspector?" Craddock nodded, flipping open his notebook. "It places Holt at the scene, or at least his watch. His alibi holds, though. Carter at the Red Lion confirms he was there from 7:30 until nearly 9, with half a dozen witnesses. Grayson's time of death, based on the coroner's report, is between 6:30 and 7:30. If Holt was arguing with someone at 6, as Mrs. Price's husband saw, he could have been involved, but the pub alibi complicates things." Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind threading the new information into her pattern. "A watch stopped at 10 minutes to 7, she said softly. "Suggests it was damaged during a struggle, perhaps when the chain broke. But if Mr. Holt was at the pub by 7:30, he had little time to commit murder and dispose of the watch. Unless," she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, "unless the watch was placed there deliberately, to point us toward him." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "You think someone framed him?" "Like with the note pointing to Sylvia Trent?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a farmer who lost a buckle in a barn fire, only to learn it was planted to make him look guilty. The watch and chain are too convenient, Inspector, much like that note with its bold S. Someone is directing this play, and they're using props to mislead us." She glanced at the watch again, noting its scratched face. "Have you checked if it's running slow? A stopped watch isn't always accurate." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. "Good point. We'll have it tested. If it was slow, it could shift the timeline. Any other thoughts?" Miss Marple's needles, which she had picked up absently, clicked softly as she considered. "The prop box where the watch was found, where was it exactly?" "Near the costume rack," Craddock replied, "tucked behind some old swords and a crate of fake jewels. Not a place you'd stumble on by accident, but easy enough to hide something in a hurry." Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring the chaotic backstage of the Lyceum. The prop box, like the crumpled programme and the smudged whiskey glass, was another piece of the killer's stagecraft. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, who'd hidden stolen tools in a shed, only to be betrayed by a speck of paint. Whoever hid that watch knew the backstage well, she said. Someone familiar with its nooks and crannies, perhaps a stagehand, or someone who once was. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Sylvia Trent used to work as a stagehand, didn't she? And she admitted to being backstage that night, indeed, Miss Marple said, her smile faint but knowing. But so did Mr. Vance, Miss Morton, and Mr. Holt, all of whom know the Lyceum's layout. The question is, who had reason to point suspicion at Mr. Holt and at Miss Trent with that note? The killer is clever, Inspector, but cleverness can be its own undoing. She set her knitting aside, her mind turning to the village gossip, Sylvia's stained coat, Clara's tears, Holt's argument near the stage door. Each was a clue, but the watch chain felt like a deliberate stroke in a larger design. Craddock leaned back, rubbing his chin. We're rechecking alibis today. Vance's lighting crew confirms he was with them from 7 to 8, though they're vague on the exact start time. Clara's landlady says she was home by 9, but no one saw her leave the theatre. Sylvia has no alibi after 7, and Holt's pub visit checks out, but that watch chain keeps him in the frame. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Alibis are like costumes, Inspector. Sometimes they fit perfectly. Sometimes they're a bit loose. I'd be curious to know if anyone saw Mr. Holt wearing that watch recently, despite his claim of losing it weeks ago. And the prop box, did Mr. Dobbs, the stage manager, notice anything odd about it before he found the body? Craddock made another note. I'll ask Dobbs. He's been cooperative, but he's a bit rattled. Says the backstage was a mess that night, with everyone running about. He paused, then added, You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'd have missed half these details without you. Miss Marple's smile was modest, almost self-deprecating. Oh, I'm no detective, Inspector. I just notice things, as one does in a village like St. Mary Mead. People's habits, their little tells, they're like stitches in a pattern. Pull one, and the whole thing unravels. She glanced out the window, where the village green lay quiet under the morning sun. I think we're close to pulling that stitch, don't you? As Craddock gathered his evidence bag and prepared to leave, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the watch chain. Its presence near the body, coupled with the stopped watch, suggested a moment frozen in time, a moment the killer wanted them to see. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead shopkeeper, who'd planted a broken pipe to implicate a rival, only to be caught by his own carelessness. The watch chain, like the note and the indigo thread, was a prop in a carefully staged drama, but Miss Marple was determined to find the flaw in the script. With a faint nod to herself, she picked up her knitting, ready to weave the next thread in the mystery of the Strangled Playwright. Chapter 11. The Rival's Motive. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated Miss Jane Marple's cottage as she sat by her window, the village of St. Mary Mead cloaked in the hush of early evening. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the whirl of thoughts in her mind. The investigation into Leonard Grayson's murder had reached a delicate juncture, with clues like the watch chain, the smudged whiskey glass, and the accusing note forming a pattern that was almost, but not quite, complete. Inspector Craddock had agreed to let her speak privately with Sylvia Trent, sensing that the rival playwright's guarded demeanour held a key to the mystery. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human nature, knew that a gentle touch could unravel secrets that force alone might not tighter. Sylvia arrived promptly at 6, her angular face pale in the lamplight, her indigo scarf wound tightly around her neck as if it were a shield. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, her dark eyes wary as they met Miss Marple's serene gaze. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and clipped, "Inspector Craddock said you wanted to see me. I've told him everything I know about that night. What more is there to say?" Miss Marple rose, her movement slow and deliberate, and gestured to a chair by the small table where a teapot steamed gently. "Please, sit, Miss Trent," she said, her tone as warm as the tea she poured. "I find a cup of tea can make even the most difficult conversations a little easier. I only wish to understand, you see. In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that people sometimes hold back, not because they're guilty, but because they're hurt." Her smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Sylvia's fingers clutched the scarf's edge, a gesture as telling as a misplaced stitch. Sylvia sat, her posture rigid, her hands smoothing the scarf as if to calm herself. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I told the inspector I was at the Lyceum to confront Leonard about his play. He stole my ideas, and I wanted answers." That's all. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting resting in her lap as she poured tea. "It must have been terribly painful, my dear, to see your work overlooked while Mr. Grayson's flourished. I understand Moonlit Shadows was a fine play, and very like The Crimson Veil in its themes. To lose such an opportunity—" She paused, her voice soft but probing, like a needle threading through fabric. "It would make anyone angry, perhaps even desperate." Sylvia's eyes flashed, a spark of the bitterness she'd shown at the vicarage. "Angry, yes," she said, her voice rising. "He read my script, Miss Marple. I showed it to him last year, hoping for advice, and he used it, twisted it into his own work. When I confronted him, he laughed, said I was delusional, that no one would believe me. I hated him for it, but I didn't kill him." Her fingers twisted the scarf tightly, the silk straining under her grip. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "I believe you felt deeply wronged," she said, "and that note we found. You'll pay for stealing my work. It must have been a shock to hear about. You said you didn't write it, but it points so directly at you. Have you any idea who might have?" Sylvia's face paled, and she set her teacup down with a faint clink. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told Leonard he'd pay. Yes, but I meant in reputation, not like that. Someone must have heard me, or—" She trailed off, her eyes darting to the window, where the village lay in twilight. "Someone wants it to look like I did it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind weaving Sylvia's words into the tapestry of the case. The note's angular handwriting, the indigo thread in the curtain, the smudged whiskey glass, all suggested a killer who thrived on misdirection. Sylvia's history as a stagehand, her familiarity with the Lyceum's backstage, made her a plausible suspect, but her fear felt genuine, not the calculated guilt of a murderer. Miss Marple recalled a saint, Mary Mead seamstress who'd been framed for theft by a rival who left a forged letter in her sewing box. "Miss Trent," she said gently, "when you left the Lyceum that night, did you notice anything unusual? Perhaps someone lingering, or something out of place?" Sylvia frowned, her fingers stilling on the scarf. It was chaotic. Roland Vance shouting at the crew, Clara Morton's voice from her dressing room, Edmund Holt pacing near the stage door. "I didn't stay long, but—" She hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "There was a moment, just as I was leaving, when I saw a shadow on the catwalk above. I thought it was a stagehand, but it moved quickly, like they didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. The catwalk, a detail she'd noted at the crime scene, with its scuffed ladder rung. "A shadow," she murmured. "Very interesting. And your coat, Miss Trent. Mrs. Price mentioned a dark stain on it that night. Could it have been from the theatre, perhaps?" Sylvia's hands froze, her face tightening. "My coat!" "It was muddy from the lane. It had been raining. I didn't think anything of it." Her voice was defensive, but her eyes held a flicker of panic, as if the question had struck a nerve. Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring. "Of course, my dear." Mud is easily explained, but small things, you see, can mean so much in a village like St. Mead. She paused, her mind turning to the indigo thread, the watch chain, the note, all pieces of a puzzle designed to mislead. Sylvia's motive was clear, her opportunity plausible, but the staged evidence suggested a cleverer hand at work. She thought of a saint. Mary Mead Gardner, who'd been accused of theft after a rival, planted a stolen trowel in his shed. The killer, she suspected, was using Sylvia as a prop in their drama. As Sylvia sipped her tea, her composure fraying, Miss Marple probed gently. "You knew the Lyceum well, didn't you? From your time as a stagehand. The ropes, the curtains, the catwalk, such knowledge would be useful, wouldn't it, for someone planning something?" Sylvia's eyes widened, and she set her cup down sharply. "You think I used that knowledge to kill him?" "I didn't, Miss Marple. I swear it. Yes, I know the theatre, but so does Roland Vance. He's there every day. And Clara, she's always poking about backstage. Even Holt knows the place, always fussing over costs." Her voice rose, a mix of fear and defiance, and her fingers twisted the scarf until it seemed it might tear. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. "I'm not accusing you, Miss Trent," she said softly. "I only want to understand. The truth, you see, is like a play. It reveals itself in the quiet moments, when the actors think the curtain is down." She smiled, her eyes kind but unyielding, and Sylvia seemed to relax, if only slightly. The conversation drew to a close, and Sylvia rose, her scarf clutched tightly. "I didn't kill him," she said again, her voice low, "but I wish I knew who did." She left the cottage, her footsteps fading into the evening, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes drifting to the window, where the village lights twinkled like stars. Sylvia's fear, the shadow on the catwalk, the stained coat, all were threads in a tapestry that was nearly complete. The killer, she knew, had crafted a clever script, using the note and the watch chain to point at Sylvia and Holt. But the catwalk, the indigo thread, the smudged glass, these were the killer's mistakes, small but significant. She recalled a St. Mary Mead vicar who'd been caught lying about a theft, because of a misplaced prayer book. The truth, she murmured, is in the shadows, waiting to step into the light. With a faint smile, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, ready to weave the final threads in the mystery of the Strangled Playwright. Chapter 12. The Final Act. The Lyceum Theatre, its faded grandeur softened by the golden light of late afternoon, stood as a silent witness to the denouement of Leonard Grayson's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her slight figure wrapped in a familiar tweed coat, entered the auditorium with Inspector Craddock, her knitting bag, a quiet companion at her side. The suspects, Roland Vance, Clara Morton, Edmund Holt, and Sylvia Trent, had been summoned to the theatre under the pretext of a final round of questions. They sat in the front row, their faces a study in tension, each unaware of the drama about to unfold. The stage, still set with the half-finished grandeur of the Crimson Veil, seemed an apt backdrop for the truth Miss Marple was ready to reveal. Craddock stood at the foot of the stage, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of quiet authority. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed auditorium. "We've gathered evidence, heard your accounts, and pieced together what happened the night Leonard Grayson was killed. Miss Marple has been kind enough to assist, and she has some observations to share." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes mild but unyielding behind her spectacles. "It's a sad business, murder," she began, her voice soft yet clear, like a bell ringing in a quiet village. "But it's often the small things, those overlooked details, that reveal the truth. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen many secrets unravel because of a misplaced word or a careless gesture. Here, in this theatre, the killer has played a clever part, but they've left threads for us to follow." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the suspects. Roland Vance sat rigidly, his cufflinks glinting as he twisted them nervously. Clara Morton, her face pale, clutched her handbag, her eyes still shadowed by her recent confession. Edmund Holt mopped his brow, his jovial mask slipping under the weight of scrutiny. Sylvia Trent, her indigo scarf tightly wound, stared at the stage, her fingers trembling slightly. Miss Marple turned to the evidence table, where the whiskey glass, the crumpled programme, the broken watch chain, and a sample of the crimson curtain cord lay. "Let us begin with the clues," she said. "The whiskey glass, smudged with fingerprints, suggested someone shared a drink with Mr. Grayson, or wanted us to think so. The fingerprints, Inspector Craddock tells me, are now identified as Miss Trent's, but smudged, as if wiped in haste. Too convenient, I thought, much like the note in the programme. You'll pay for stealing my work. S. Pointing so, directly at Miss Trent, Sylvia's head snapped up, her voice sharp. "I told you, I didn't write it. I didn't kill him." Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile gentle. "I believe you, Miss Trent." The note's handwriting was too precise, too staged, as if meant to mislead. "In my village, I once knew a woman who forged a letter to frame a rival. This note was a prop designed to cast suspicion on you." She turned to the watch chain. "And Mr. Holt's watch, found in a prop box with its chain broken near the body. It seemed to point to him. But Mr. Holt's alibi at the Red Lion holds firm, and the watch, stopped at 10 minutes to 7, was slow, wasn't it, Inspector?" Craddock nodded. "Tests confirmed it was running 10 minutes behind. If it broke during a struggle, it shifts the timeline slightly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Exactly. A clever touch, but not clever enough." The watch was placed to implicate Mr. Holt, just as the note targeted Miss Trent. But the real clue lies in the murder weapon, the crimson curtain cord tied with an intricate knot, one only someone familiar with stage rigging could manage. She turned to the stage, where the grand staircase and torn curtain stood, and that indigo thread, caught in the curtain's tear, matches Miss Trent's scarf. Yet, I wondered, was it hers, or another prop in this deadly play? Sylvia's hand flew to her scarf, her face paling. "It's just a scarf." "I was backstage, yes, but I didn't touch the curtain." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soothing. "I know, my dear." But someone did. Someone who knew the Lyceum's backstage, who could tie a knot, who wanted to point us towards you and Mr. Holt while hiding their own part. She turned to the suspects, her gaze settling on Roland Vance, whose cufflinks gleamed as he shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Vance, you're a director, accustomed to controlling every detail of a production. Mr. Grayson's interference threatened your vision, didn't it?" Vance's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. "I told you, we argued, but I didn't kill him. I was with the lighting crew." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "but their account is vague on when you joined them. You knew the backstage well, and you were angry enough, perhaps, to act in a moment of rage." She turned to Clara. "Miss Morton, your affair with Grayson gave him power over you, but your tears were of shame, not guilt. You didn't kill him, though you feared his threats." Clara's eyes welled, and she nodded silently. Miss Marple's gaze moved to Holt. "Mr. Holt, your debts made you desperate, but your alibi is solid. The watch chain was a plant, meant to mislead." Holt exhaled, his relief palpable. Finally, she turned to Sylvia. "Miss Trent, your envy of Grayson was real, and your knowledge of stagecraft made you a perfect suspect. But the shadow you saw on the catwalk, the stained coat, your fear, they tell me you were a witness, not a killer." Sylvia's shoulders slumped, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Miss Marple stepped closer to the stage, her voice rising slightly. "The killer needed opportunity, knowledge, and a motive strong enough to act. The cord's knot, the stage note, the planted watch, all point to someone who thrives on misdirection, who knows the theatre's secrets." She turned to Sylvia, her eyes softening. "Miss Trent, you were a stagehand once, weren't you? You knew how to tie a sailor's knot, the kind used on the curtain cord. And your anger at Grayson, your belief that he stole your work, it consumed you, didn't it?" Sylvia's face crumpled, and she stood, her scarf falling to the floor. I couldn't stand it," she sobbed. "He mocked me, said my play was nothing. I went to confront him, and he laughed, said I'd never be him. I grabbed the cord in a rage. It was there on the rack, and I strangled him. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop." Her voice broke, and she sank back into her seat, tears streaming down her face. "I hid the watch to point at Holt, used the note to confuse things. I thought I could make it look like someone else." The auditorium was silent, the weight of her confession hanging like a heavy curtain. Craddock stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Sylvia Trent, you're under arrest for the murder of Leonard Grayson." He signalled to a constable, who led Sylvia away, her sobs echoing in the empty theatre. Miss Marple turned to Craddock, her expression tinged with sadness. "Envy, Inspector, is a terrible thing," she said softly. "It twists the heart like a cord, until there's no turning back. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen it before. A jealousy that destroys both the envious and their target. As the suspects dispersed, the Lyceum's lights dimmed, and Miss Marple stepped into the evening air, her knitting bag at her side. The village was quiet once more, its secrets laid bare. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, driven to ruin by envy, and sighed. "The curtain falls," she murmured, "but the play goes on." With a faint smile, she walked home, ready for the next mystery to unravel in St. Mary Mead.